Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. My name is Erik Milito. I'm with the American Petroleum Institute, and I've been invited here to talk about fracking, or as our experts like to call it, hydraulic fracturing. Inside the industry, we like to make sure the proper term is used. Unfortunately, the opponents have tried to castigate hydraulic fracturing and create a shadow around it by making this ominous, theoretical, abstract theory around fracking, but I'm here to tell you fracking is a great thing. It's a great engineering technology. Combined with horizontal drilling, it's really created a pathway toward almost eventual energy independence. Anybody from Notre Dame here? No Notre Dame? Anybody here know who Father Ted Hesburgh is? We may have seen, he unfortunately passed away. Great man, lived 98 years. It's actually, I think, a great time to celebrate somebody's life when they've had that long of a great life. But he once was quoted as saying that Notre Dame has football, Texas has oil, and neither should apologize. So now it should be America has oil, and America should not be apologizing for the oil we have. So I'm going to talk a bit about fracking. I'm going to talk more broadly about that as well. I think it's going to be worth mentioning some what's happening offshore, because energy policy, you got to look at it through a lot of different lenses, and what happens in Washington has a great impact on what we as an energy superpower and what we as a country can accomplish. So I'm going to be going back and forth. Some of the great news: we are now the largest producer of natural gas in the world. If you look back, 2008, we were expected to be importing $100 billion of natural gas a year from West Africa, Australia, the Middle East, and Russia. Not happening. In fact, we're looking at exporting natural gas because we have so much of it. We are now in an era of abundance, not scarcity. And the story continues because we saw natural gas. What's happening here? There we go. We saw natural gas early on as the big boom when it came to the application of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. And as you see here, U.S. natural gas production now accounts for 20% of the world's total production. It's amazing what is happening here in the United States when it comes to natural gas production. And oil production has skyrocketed as well. Back in 2009, we were around 5 million barrels a day production, and now we're over 9 million barrels a day. Nobody ever thought this would happen, and it's really shifting the global geopolitical dynamics around energy in a very good way for our country, and for many of you, you're seeing it at the pump today. We're expected to become the number one producer of crude oil within the next couple of years, and we will surpass what our records were that we set in the 1970s. It's truly amazing what is happening when it comes to oil and natural gas production. These are the headlines, Wall Street Journal. These are back in 2013. Time magazine, U.S. is an energy superpower, and U.S. fracking success threatens Russian economy and Russian strategy, all because what is happening based upon U.S. ingenuity, U.S. entrepreneurship, and the application of technologies. Interesting thing, it's just only happening here in the United States. These red and yellow shadings show you that all around the world there are shale and tight sands, tight formations where you could apply these technologies and presumably produce these resources. So there are parts of the world that have much greater natural gas resources. You get a place like South Africa, Algeria, Argentina, Russia, China, places in Europe have it, but it's only happening here, which really shows you just how great the U.S. workforce and the U.S. oil and gas industry really is when it comes to getting this good rock and getting oil and gas out of it, because that's what it really comes down to. The U.S., we have good rock. And that's where we get the oil and gas, and we're able to get it out of there. We have to remember, moving forward, there's a lot of talk about renewables. We need all of the energy. We have all the above is what the president says. Sure, we do need all the above, but in the U.S., we're going to require 12% more energy, and in 2040, most of our energy, as projected by this administration, this Department of Energy, is still going to rely on oil, natural gas, and coal for close to 80% of our energy needs. Renewables are going to double and maybe even triple or quadruple. Conservation is going to continue. Efficiency is going to be improved. But still, even with efficiency expanding, renewables expanding, we're going to need a lot of oil and natural gas. So fundamentally, the question becomes, from a policy standpoint, where do we want to get it? Do we want to get it from here? The answer should be yes. And globally, the world competes for oil and is now competing more and more for natural gas. Globally, energy demand is going to increase by about 50%, and the world is going to use oil, natural gas for well over 50% of its needs. And you combine coal, it's the same thing. It's 70 to 80% of the energy the world will be using will be from fossil fuels. So there's nothing wrong with renewables, but we just have to be based in a reality that our economy and the world economy will continue to rely on oil and natural gas. So these are the fundamental issues that face us. How do we have energy policy looking ahead to make sure we have affordable, reliable supplies in the future? And it's happening all over the country, but it's happening on private and state land. It's not happening on federal land. Oil and gas production is up dramatically on private lands. If you look where it's happening, you have the Permian Basin in West Texas, where you have increased by 1 million barrels a day in oil production. Eagle Ford is the same increase in production by 1 million barrels a day. The Barnett in Texas with tremendous natural gas production. Marcellus Shale providing 15% of our natural gas production. The Bakken, everybody knows about North Dakota, 1 million barrels a day. It's happening everywhere. But we also know that historically we've produced a lot of oil and natural gas in the Rockies. And the federal government controls a lot of land in the Rockies. The federal government controls 700 million acres of oil and gas estate, most of it out west. And we've seen production of oil and gas drop on federal lands. That's because there's less of an incentive to develop resources on federal lands. If you want to get a permit to drill a well in a place like North Dakota, Pennsylvania, it might take you 20 or 30 days. If you want to get a permit on federal land, it takes 200 days. So from an investment standpoint, you want to have certainty that you're going to be allowed to follow through on that money you're willing and want to spend, and you can do that in private territory, but it's not happening on federal land. And how is it happening? I don't know how deep into the technology you'd want to get, but historically, we talked about conventional production, and it's higher permeability, higher porosity, where the oil and gas are able to flow, and they have the natural pressures so that when you drill a well vertically, the oil and gas, through the natural pressure of the earth, is able to flow through your well and up to the production system and into the pipelines and to the market. You think about it as being a jar of marbles, where the marbles are the rock, and the area between the marbles is where the oil and gas flows. So historically, you would drill into that type of formation, 1,000, several thousand feet. Offshore, it's still conventional drilling. It can be up to 30,000 feet below the seabed. But that's how we did it, and it was done through a lot of wildcatting, exploratory activity where you had to find the oil by drilling wells. Things have changed quite a bit because there's a lot less of that conventional oil and natural gas. But it's happened in a great way, one, because of advanced seismic technology. So we can get out there with seismic surveys and really see what the geology looks like and see where the shale or tight sandstone seams are. And we've known that this rock, which is low permeability and low porosity, actually has oil and gas in it. So I'm going to hand these out. Please promise me you'll get these back because these were very hard for me to get. So we've got, this is the Argentine shale, which is not too far from Santiago, Chile in Argentina, an oil shale. And this is the Eagle Ford, which has natural gas. It's in Texas. And this is the Marcellus shale, which is Pennsylvania. This is the Middle East. Saudi Arabia actually has some shale. And you can almost smell it. You can almost smell it's oily because there's oil and natural gas in there. It's low porosity, low permeability. And so what it takes is the ability to take good rock. In the old days, you just drilled into the rock and it flowed, break it open. So hydraulic fracturing is drilling into the seam several thousand feet. So you go 6,000 feet down or so, and then another 5,000 or 6,000 feet. And you have this whole fairway. So before we were kind of hunting for the oil and gas and then gathering it when we found it. Now we're essentially farming it. We know from seismic surveys where it is, so we were able to almost every time have a successful well. You're not drilling dry holes. So you drill into the formation. You have several layers of pipe and cement called casing and cement to protect the groundwater aquifers. So you have redundant layers in place. And then you put charges down here to put holes into the piping, called perforating guns, and they put holes in the piping. And then you bring on your frack crew. So that's where the word fracking comes in. You do frack jobs where you pump high volumes of oil, sand, and chemicals to break open the rock. So you put these holes in there, and the water and sand is pumped at a high enough pressure, up 6,000 to 9,000 psi, and it breaks open the rock. And once you've done that, you've got a well that's flowing. The great thing here is you can reduce the environmental impact at the surface, less of an environmental footprint. So if this room was where we did it in the old days, you might have one well in the middle. Now you might drill 6 different wells, and then you'll have 6 wells flowing on the same pad. So you don't have to do 6 different surface disturbances. You can just do one. And it truly is amazing that this has been criticized as something that's bad for the environment when we're actually having less of an impact at the surface. It's really neat how it's done. So that's it. It's actually been around for 65 years. Halliburton in 1949 had the first commercial fracturing that was done, over 300 jobs that year, and we've done it over 1 million times. A lot of people don't know that. Horizontal drilling's been around since the 30s, but the original fracturing was done vertically. You just went down and you did that to stimulate the oil and gas coming from conventional wells. Now we're doing it where we're combining the horizontal drilling and the hydraulic fracturing. Those two combined are what really are driving the success of the industry, and that really started 2006, 2007, 2008 because it was so cost prohibitive, but the industry got better and better, research, development, tests, some work with the government. George Mitchell was the father of fracturing, and it evolved to the point where today it's producing probably, it's 90% of the wells today use hydraulic fracturing. So it's what is driving our energy security and our national security in many ways. So what's happening now? It's been a huge boom to the economy from 2007 to 2012. That was the height of the recession. During those years, the oil and gas industry created jobs at a 40% rate. The rest of the economy was pretty flat. And we've seen some articles recently which were kind of neat. Can fracking save the world? This one was probably my favorite. How fracking has saved Obama. Because it was actually this industry that created all these jobs at a real downtime during his administration. So the private industry was actually supporting the economy in many respects because we were developing energy here at home. 2012, according to IHS, Daniel Yergin's group, more than 2.1 million jobs were supported because of unconventional development, the use of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. It's expected to rise to 3.9 million jobs. Manufacturing, over 500,000 jobs are expected to be supported. Because natural gas prices are so low, we have a lot of chemical plants, manufacturing plants coming in to utilize this low-cost, affordable resource. Jobs are high-paying. Capital expenditures are very high, over $120 billion just on these types of technologies in 2012, rising to $240 billion by 2025. GDP impact over $250 billion today and rising to over $500 billion. Lots of revenues for state and federal government. Nothing subsidized by the government, yet the government gets the benefit of a lot of income taxes and other taxes that are paid. Actually, it's helped households by lowering the cost of energy as well. Infrastructure is another big thing. We can produce all the oil and gas we want. We can refine it. Our refiners are refining record amounts of crude oil for gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, distillates, everything. But we need to have infrastructure to do it. Everybody knows about Keystone XL pipeline. That would not just be Canadian oil flowing through that, would have oil flowing from the Bakken. So we wouldn't have to send it all on rail cars. We could put a lot in the pipelines. So infrastructure decisions are huge. Infrastructure could support a lot of jobs as well. In some peak years, we would see over 1 million jobs supported by infrastructure development. We need pipelines, we need ports, we need We need rail infrastructure. We need all this so we can connect the production to the consumer at the end. So we can get a lot of benefits by building out infrastructure, but we have delays in policy decisions, such like the Keystone XL pipeline. We have over 70 oil and gas pipes that cross the U.S.-Canada border. So we're fighting over one, but there are others that could be held up as well. I already talked a bit about the holdups that we've seen on federal land. That's why I had this slide here. Wanted to mention offshore because this is another area where the federal government makes the decision. If you look up here in Canada, off Nova Scotia, off of Newfoundland and Labrador, Canadians are developing resources, major oil and gas fields. The biggest offshore platform is off the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. There's a town there called St. John's that was declared to be near extinct, but it was revived from its coma by the oil and gas industry. So it's a seaport. It's thriving now because the Canadians embraced offshore development. So they have tourism, they have fisheries, they have energy as well. They've diversified their economy. Cuba is drilling wells. The Bahamas are going to be developing resources. The Bahamas could be developing resources closer to the Florida coast than our own government would potentially allow us to developing resources along the Atlantic. 87% of our offshore territories are off limits right now because this administration has decided to restrain us to the western and central Gulf and these portions of Alaska. But also understand that in Alaska, they have dragged their feet, and it took 6 years to get a permit issued, and then all that had to stop because of the restrictions that were put on development there. So Alaska, we have almost 27 billion barrels of oil known to be in the offshore, 10 billion barrels in ANWR. Just to mention ANWR, all of ANWR is about the size of South Carolina. 8 million acres of that is already designated as wilderness. So ANWR has a lot of wilderness area that's protected. What the law would set out is that the coastal plain, which doesn't have trees, doesn't have glacial ponds, is not wilderness. What the law states is that that is an area that should be looked at for oil and gas production. There's believed to be 10 billion barrels of oil there. And the surface footprint could be no bigger than 2,000 acres, so the size of Dulles Airport. So all this argument you hear about how we can't touch ANWR, well, ANWR largely, 90% of it wouldn't be touched. You're talking about a very small portion. And keep in mind that when you develop oil and gas resources, the state of Alaska relies on oil and gas. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline System relies on throughput of oil. It's declining. Our opponents would like to see it decline further so that they could argue for it to be shut down, major strategic asset. But right to the west of ANWR, the state of Alaska is developing oil resources right there. It's just essentially a line that is arbitrarily drawn that's not allowing the development of 10 billion barrels. So these are policies in place. We're right now in the process of looking at the next plan. So the way they allow this to be developed is they put a 5-year plan together. The current one runs from 2012 to 2017 and it allows the areas in blue to be developed. The next one starts in 2017. So the first draft came out and it proposed a lease sale in the Atlantic from Virginia to Georgia in the year 2021. And the only way the government can go from here is narrower. So they go big to small. And we'd like to see it start out as big, 10 billion barrels in the Pacific, lots of oil here. But they've already started out narrow, and Secretary Jewell has already said we can still take out what's already in there. So we're very concerned that we're still going to be restricted because the Gulf of Mexico provides us with a lot of our oil that we use in our cars, natural gas, we burn in our stoves in our homes. But the production we have there now is because of decisions we made 15, 20 years ago. So you go back to that earlier slide where we can get our energy in 2040, we need to make decisions now so that we have opportunities for that. We don't even know what's out here. They haven't even allowed us to do seismic surveys. We just want to see what's there. We can't do that based upon the policies that are in place now. So it's very important that we create additional opportunities because the rest of the world is doing that. And for us to continue to be a global energy superpower, we need to produce U.S. resources. And decisions like this are what other countries around the world, they laugh at that. They're like, why would you ever restrict investment when this creates so many jobs and could create more jobs? Quest Offshore did a study saying the Atlantic could create 280,000 jobs, and then government revenue. We talk about taxes, but when you produce resources on federal land, you pay royalties, bonuses, rentals, and in some years the government has got $20 billion from offshore development. They've issued a lease as a rental of an offshore area of acreage, 3 mile by 3 mile, 5,700 acres. And they've gotten some of those issued for $150 million for one. And then once you have it, you pay rentals. And then when you produce oil or natural gas, you pay revenue. So if you opened up the Atlantic, the estimates are over an 18-year period, the federal government could get $51 billion, all paid for by the private sector. And states, if you have revenue sharing, could get $19 billion. Great opportunities, but not being seized. We talked about Keystone. These refiners here spent billions of dollars to be able to take on heavier type of crudes like those up in Alberta that are being produced. Those types of crudes now come from places like Venezuela. Federal regulations, there's a whole slew of them. All of these agencies, all 12 of them, are now looking at hydraulic fracturing in some way, whether to apply regulations to it or to study it or to in some way potentially disrupt it. Now, we have to recognize, I have some bunch of slides in the back, but I'm not going to get into them, that state governments have been regulating the drilling of oil and gas in their borders for 150 years, and they do it very well. And we've seen over the past 10 years that they adapt very quickly. Federal government, they tend to move kind of slowly when it comes to creating new rules for developing resources. It takes years. Pennsylvania's probably revised their regulations 15 times in the past 5 years. Colorado keeps revising them. Texas, Oklahoma. These states know how to do it. They know the geology. They know the hydrology. And they want to be the ones managing their water rights. So you start talking about this, they start talking about the federal government stepping into state government water rights, and that's a touchy issue. So we're vigilant here, trying to make sure that we let the states do this. They do a good job. It's not unregulated. The opponents will tell you this industry is not regulated. It's heavily regulated at the state level. We as an industry encourage the states to have good regulations in place. It builds trust with the public and it makes sure that there is a code across the industry. And we also want to make sure that they have inspectors, enforcement. That's just part of the deal when you're going to develop resources. There's going to be regulations. There's rules. There's going to be enforcement. But the best place to do that is the state level, not the federal level here. Ozone, many of you may know about this, but there's a proposal out that could put potentially the whole country in non-attainment for ozone. It would be the most expensive rulemaking ever in the history of the country. It could be $140 billion a year, over $2 trillion, I think, over the next couple of decades. 270 billion lost to GDP per year, but I think it's 140 billion in costs to actually comply with it. 2.9 million fewer jobs or job equivalents per year. This is a big deal. The EPA is required to have this done by September. They're taking comments. We're hoping that the states who will be most impacted by this will be stepping up, their governors or legislatures, saying that, we are still implementing the 2008 standard, which is a level of 75 parts per billion or million, and you're already talking about coming out with a new one. Let us get the old one in place. Air is improving. The air is the cleanest it's been before you make this huge step that will impact state and the nation's economy across. They're coming begging us to just put it on the market so there's more out there and Russia has less of an influence. And when you do that, you actually invigorate production here in the United States because there's only so many outlets we have for our oil and natural gas. So from a crude perspective, this is a conservative analysis. It says there will be 500,000 additional barrels produced per day. That's a lot more jobs, a lot more investment. 300,000 more jobs. And on each of these, because you're putting more oil into the global marketplace, we're seeing projections of the price of gasoline actually going down because you're putting more oil on the global market. The price of gasoline is tied to the global price of crude oil. But that was a conservative one. That was a study we did. IHS, Daniel Yergin's group, projects that gasoline would go down about 8 cents, but they're projecting close to 1 million jobs in some years, as well as 1 million or more barrels of oil per day produced here in the United States. So the projections show that we have abundant supplies, would produce more oil here if we had exports available, would create more jobs, and we would actually put downward pressure on the price of gasoline. So it's a pretty good story, but this is an area where the president or Congress would have to step in because it's banned based upon some early 1970s decisions. Gas exports, it's a bit different process. It's not banned, but there's a very, very slow process. That's a big area where you can impact Russia by putting more gas on the market. Think about what we're doing now. We're going to take $100 billion of gas into the U.S. per year. We don't have to do that anymore. So even that being out on the market has helped our allies. But if we could put some on the market in terms of exports, would be in a pretty good position. But this just shows you how much gas we believe we have. We consume about 25 TCF a year. The government has us at about 2,200 TCF. ICF International has it over 3,000. This is what we consume, would be projected to consume over a 20-year period, and this is what the projections would be for how much we would export, but they're just not approving these. It's presumed to be in the public interest, but I'm sorry, they're not approving these applications. This is where you see the terminals that would be proposed. We have one out here in Maryland, several on the Gulf Coast, a couple out in Oregon that are kind of waiting approval and waiting to start exporting. And then the government's own study said across all scenarios, the U.S. is projected to gain net economic benefits from allowing LNG exports. And actually, what it says, with the higher exports that you have, the more economic benefits you get. So all the economists agree. Get a lot of jobs. In the high export case, you would average over 400,000 jobs a year because of all the additional production, all the additional construction, manufacturing jobs. But there would be significant job growth by allowing this because you have all the additional gas being produced here. And you also have another thing that's being produced with the gas. It's natural gas liquids, ethane, propane, butane, stuff that's used here in the U.S. for petrochemical production and for making plastics, things like that. So it's a good story. And there's the other thing we have to recognize is the rest of the world wants to build these LNG export terminals and have this as something that brings money into their economy. Exports almost always bring money into your economy because the rest of the world's buying from you. But there's great competition. The current world capacity for shipping LNG is 37 BCF a day, but we believe this shaded area is all the world could take. So the rest of the world has this much proposed. We have this much proposed. And if our government doesn't approve any of it, then these $5, $10, $15 billion projects won't get built here. They'll get built somewhere else. Russia, the Middle East, other countries will have that strategic edge and be able to sell their gas when we won't. On the national security side, our chairman of our Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, 4-star, testified before Congress and said that energy should be a prominent tool as we move into the future from a national security standpoint. An energy independent net exporter of energy as a nation has the potential to change the security environment around the world, notably in Europe. That's with Russia and then the Middle East. So as we look to the future, we've got to pay more in particular attention to energy as an instrument of national power, and because it will very soon in the next few years potentially become one of our more prominent tools. You may have got this. These are some of the lessons that we have, but I think that's one of the keys, that if we are now an energy superpower, it's going to take some guts by the federal government. I don't think it takes a lot of guts to be able to make decisions to allow us to embrace our position as an energy superpower and use it like one. Russia is using energy as a tool over all the people around it. They cut the gas supplies off. The people in Ukraine get fed up with their leadership. They have internal turmoil, and that's exactly what Putin wants. If we're putting energy out there, Russia has less of a market because we're flooding more energy into the markets. That's a big thing that's happening now. The rest of the world's watching what's happening here. And part of the price drop is occurring because we're producing so much more oil here, the price of gasoline and crude oil going down. The rest of the world doesn't want to lose market share. So you see OPEC nations, other nations, a lot of times in the past they would drop their production to keep the price up. They've kept it up because they want to preserve their market share. So it is an international competition, and we are really driving it here in the U.S. because of hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling. But to do that and maintain on that path, we have to embrace it and not turn an eye to it. Several years ago, President Obama talked about fossil fuels as the energy of the past. His State of the Unions have changed a little bit. He recognized that a lot of the jobs that have been created are because of that, but at the same time, his actions aren't meeting his words. We need actions to allow the private sector, the competitive enterprise of the United States to be allowed to develop resources here in the U.S. That's my presentation. I will take questions. Back, since your hand was up first. Mm-hmm. No. On the latter question, it's because the companies who do the stimulation, the hydraulic fracturing, they're global companies. Schlumberger is a French company. They employ 40,000 people in the United States because Baker Hughes, which is being bought by Halliburton, they're international companies, so all it takes is operators going in and bringing the service companies and applying. The one thing I wanted to make clear with these rock samples, if you could pass them back up and not pocket them, is that they are all different. So it does take some time to understand what the best combination of fracturing fluids, pressures that will actually create the best channels for the oil and gas to flow. So in the U.S., we've gotten very good at it because we've been doing it for a little while. But you'll see that it costs more when you go into new areas, even in the U.S. So the areas we've been in for a longer time, like the Barnett, the Marcellus, they get cheaper and cheaper to develop. So when you have a low price environment, the industry normally responds by getting better at what it does. And one thing I've heard is that a lot of the cost is drilling the well, and then you fracture it. Well, our fracturing practices now are way better than what they were 5 years ago. So some companies are able to go back and they don't have that cost of drilling the well. They'll go the same well and refracture it with the latest fracturing technologies and stimulate production and keep it going. So there's ways to cut costs, but it's just a matter of investment getting to those parts of the world. And we're starting to see it. Argentina, they're drilling some wells there. A lot of it's infrastructure as well as a regulatory system. We have a good regulatory system in place. The states have regs. The states have done it for years. So it's already set up for it. A lot of it's the private estate. So if you own, getting back to the New York question, I was up in the Towanda area, I think it was Columbia Crossings is where I was in Pennsylvania, very near New York. But these are people who have large farms, a lot of acreage, that have decided to lease their land and get the benefit of that money flow into their pockets. Other parts of the world don't necessarily have that. So the people on the ground, the citizens, don't necessarily understand what the benefit is. Some of these Eastern European countries, they certainly do, and they're pursuing it at a quicker pace. But it's just going to take time for the investment to flow to other parts of the world and for those countries to accept it and encourage it. New York, like I said, I was up there, and in fact, a lot of the workers, I was on a drilling rig and I was with the fracking crew. A lot of those workers live in New York. I mean, it's right there. You just drive across the border, and those people from New York are actually getting jobs. The state that has the most jobs tied to this, that is not producing oil and natural gas, is New York. It's amazing. But it's politics. I mean, if you look at a health study coming out by Governor Cuomo, it flies against every other health study that any other state or the federal government has done. It's rigged to give him a reason to not allow it to happen, and it's feeding to an activist base that is a small but very loud minority. So it's all going to be political, fortitude. But when you have that governor, it's just probably not going to happen. Sure.
Yeah, what's the break-even point on a barrel of oil to keep fracking viable?
It varies. It's interesting because we're a trade association. Our members are the companies, so we're not allowed to get in those discussions because of the antitrust laws. I was talking to somebody else about. They said, "What's the rate of return? So we're not privy to a lot of that, but there have been a lot of good articles put out there by Goldman Sachs. If you do a Google search, you'll see it. But they range from $30 up to $85. But you'll see that it's less in those regions where we've already been for a long time. So it does come down over time. Now, after you're done developing the well, once you're producing it, it doesn't really cost much. So you're going to see the wells continue to produce, and you're not going to see any of the production shut down. But what you'll see in a low price environment is the rig shifting to the areas where there's more experience and a better level of profitability because you've been there and you know what the formation looks like and you've built up the expertise to hydraulically fracture it. One thing I'll do is I'm going to skip because I think it's interesting to see a bunch of stuff in here. I was talking about how in the old days you had to drill all these wells and you could do it in a smaller footprint. We protect the groundwater through all these layers of casing and cement. But we also have microseismic, which shows you, here's the water table. The lowest it drops is 1,000 feet, and here's the fractures. So you always have essentially 3,000 or more feet in between the fractures and the water table. That's impermeable rock. It's impermeable. It's just the geology of the earth. But the one I wanted to show you was, if you look at natural gas compared to other sources of energy, wind and solar take up a lot of acreage. It takes up actually less land because you have that small producing pad. Water usage is pretty reasonable. Water intensity is also low. Natural gas is clean. We're talking about clean energy here, and we're arguing about developing natural gas. But what I wanted to show you is when you're done, this is your production. You have these are your wellheads. They're feeding into pipelines that are buried. So you do have some disruptive, noisy, dusty, a lot of trucks in the beginning, but it's temporary. The drilling could take 2 to 3 months. Some of the advanced technologies now are allowing companies to drill 10,000 feet with one drill bit. That's normally not always the case, but some of them have advanced even drill bit technology. Fracturing is 3 to 5 days. You're out there, you got a lot of trucks, you're bringing a lot of water and sand in. Those sand mines in Wisconsin and Minnesota are doing great because of all this business. But you're required to reclaim the land to what it looked like in the beginning. This water here that's being used, they have liners so that it doesn't spill and overflow. You have berms. When I was out there, there's several layers of liner that whether it's the drilling operation or so the drilling crew comes in, they drill a well, they all leave, they pick up their liners, then the fracking crew comes in and they have liners and they have berms. It's all very protected, but this is what it looks like in the end. So it's not what the opponents are making it out to be. It is disruptive in the beginning, and we want to make sure that we as API, we're also a standards developing organization. We started out developing standards. We have over 600 standards. We recently created a community engagement standard. So we're pushing out to companies to say, when you go into new communities, talk to them, be transparent, let them know what you're doing. And that's what the companies are doing. When I was on this rig tour recently, they go around, knock on neighbors' doors, they talk to them, they explain to them what's happening. That's what we need to do. When we don't do that, we're not doing a good enough job. Sir?
You guys look at this industry as all from a geopolitical perspective. So how sure are you that it's a market share game versus a national security issue? When you see the prices dropping like they are, you see the Saudis saying, okay, we're keeping the tap on out there. You guys get into that at all?
We don't get into that. We watch it, and we make sure that we talk about how that is a positive. As the American Petroleum Institute, outside of our technical standards, which are global, we develop standards for drill pipe. So how do you develop a piece of drill pipe? That's used around the world. But when it comes to advocacy, we're focused on domestic policy. We will engage on issues where our Congress, our president are making decisions that will impact trade and things like that, but we don't engage too much in the international geopolitical.
But that could be a potential threat beyond a market share game, right? It could be more of a national security issue as well, right? Because we know those that have oil energy have hard power, right? Those that don't.
Exactly. And some believe that Iran is also keeping the taps on because they want to impact Iran. They're trying to cripple Iran as much as they can because they don't like Iran. So,
I'm sure there's political things going back and forth out there. I happen to live in Benton County.
oh, Texas.
Just had some anti-fracking stuff take place there. Interesting to see who's pushing the anti-fracking group. So I saw a lot of U.S. government stuff, and I know you're representing an association, but as individuals that are politically active here, I think it's also important to look at where's that anti-fracking message coming from, and that green movement and so forth isn't all just internal politics. I mean, I saw them come in with very strong messages to the university there. I think a lot of those university students would be surprised to say that it's in Russia's best interest for fracking not to happen here. And you start to look at some of those things out there. Those are things we need to address from a national security standpoint.
Absolutely. And the other thing that's interesting is that just from a pure civic standpoint, policy was established at the state capitol and in Congress here. It's a totally different game. And we learned that from President Obama because he's built up a network of 50 million. And so what we're doing is we're developing, go to energycitizens.org, and we're recruiting people to be active on energy. And all it is people have potlucks, they have rallies, Keystone, they're calling into the White House, they're sending letters. But a lot of it is at the local level, so it's not just the federal representatives and the federal senators, but it's your local mayor. It's the people who have influence we're trying to make sure we're reaching out to. And we use a company called Micro-Targets. We now have 34 million that we reach out to who are people who support energy and are willing to get out there and be active on it. And a lot of this is the local level. Youngstown, Ohio, 5 or 6 times in a row, they put a ballot on an initiative on a ballot to shut down fracking in Youngstown, right in the heart of the Utica, near to Marcellus. We go in there, we're losing, 40 to 60, but we go in there, we get on the ground, we educate, and we always win 60 to 40 in the end. And it's interesting because we're working with non-traditional allies, as we call them, but we're working with constituencies that want jobs. So African Americans, Hispanics, women, you name it, people who represent constituencies that want their communities to have jobs, that's all they care about. Once you start telling them that this is going to bring jobs to your community, which it will and which it has done, the environmental movement becomes minimalized. So that's what we're trying to do at the local level. But it's a great point that the movement is through social media and at the local level.
I think the grassroots, when people start looking at it from a national security perspective, I think the grassroots will start activating as well. So
That's a good point.
ways we can work together on that, I think that'd be another way to look.
It's a great point that has to be recognized more at the local level. I never do Facebook. For some reason I was on it and I was getting in an argument with people about where I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and they're saying, well, there's jobs are going to people from out of state. Well, and initially jobs do go to people from out of state because that's who has the expertise, but over time, and she made the comment that, well, they just built 3 hotels here. I was like, you kind of made the point. I mean, you got 3 hotels in Butler, Pennsylvania. Who would have thought of that 10 years ago? So
I'm all for cheap gas too, right? But until I get to the point where I think, it's just a play to get the frackers out so that they can do the same thing to us and back to $4 or $5 again. People start thinking different about it.
yeah. Well, the other thing about cheap gasoline is also reflective of the economy. If the economy wasn't so stagnant, there would be higher priced fuels because I'd be consuming more. Yes?
Can you explain the recent layoffs in the oil industry if it's booming?
Well, that's reflective of the price. When the price goes low, somebody mentioned what is the break even, the industry just makes less money. It comes down to that's the product that you sell. If it's a widget, if it's an iPad and demand is not there at the level it was, or if supply goes up, it's reflective of the price. But the industry's in it for the long haul, and it's those projections. So hopefully it's just going to be a hiccup. And we're not going to have sustained impact on employment, because over time we think we're going to be pretty strong employment-wise because the demand for oil and gas is growing, because the economy is growing, because the population is growing. That's what we're hoping for. We're looking at this for the long haul. Unfortunately, we did have this recent impact, the short-term, hopefully, impact on at least some of the service companies have had some layoffs. It's unfortunate. The other thing I'm hoping, and that we have seen in the past, is that The Economist had a good article on this where they talked about when you have times of low price like this, inevitably the oil industry finds ways to get better and more efficient and cut their costs to be able to continue to produce. Yes?
Should there be a reason to be concerned with the recent increase in earthquakes in the Dallas-Fort Worth area?
Earthquakes, that's a great issue. It's called induced seismicity, and there's two different things we have to look at here. One is hydraulic fracturing, where really no risk from hydraulic fracturing. But when you're done drilling a well or fracturing a well, you got to do something with what's left, and you're allowed to dispose of water, waste, in underground injection control wells. They're UIC wells. It's regulated under the Safe Drinking Water Act. There's, I think, 800,000 or 1 million of them in the country. And it's not just our industry. It's a lot of industries that have waste inject their waste into the earth. In some cases, if you sustain that pressure from injecting this water or whatever the waste is over time, it has induced seismic activity. At a low level, a 3.0 is like a truck rumbling by, and generally it's been 3 or less. But what the states regulate that. The state regulators step up, and they've taken action to make sure that doesn't happen, or if it does happen, you got to cease activity, get a better understanding of what the geology is, and perhaps stop the injection in that well, or find ways to manage it. And it's good because we have the Interstate Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and the Groundwater Protection Council. They're two organizations that bring the states together. They're working together on guidelines for that. It's a legitimate concern, but nothing's really been damaged at this point. But at the same time, nobody wants the ground shaking. In some places, they've gotten used to it. Oklahoma has gotten used to it because they have so many injection wells in Oklahoma. But at the same time, we don't want it to happen. So best practices are going to be able to eliminate that. Sir?
We've seen reports that foreign interests, particularly the Saudis, have given billions to the foundation. And there's some people who think that the Saudis would love to see American fracking stop because it would raise oil prices. Do you think there's a risk that in a Clinton presidency or a future Democratic presidency there might be some kind of nationwide ban or restriction on fracking?
We hope not. We hope no matter who's in there, it's going to be better than what we have now, because it's been nothing but barrier after barrier. We have a document out there called Pattern of Delay and Deny, because that's what the pattern has been. And President Clinton, he actually signed a piece of positive energy legislation when he was in office. It was the Deepwater Royalty Relief Act. So all this development we have in the Deepwater Gulf of Mexico is in many respects because of the alliance he had with the Louisiana delegation in signing that. So it's hard to speculate. Will Hillary, would she be different? Possibly. John Podesta is not somebody who generally has shown to be somebody supportive of policies that would help the oil and gas industry. Some of the recent announcements on methane, he released some of those. And interesting there is that methane is natural gas. Methane is what comes out of our stove. It's what heats our hot water tanks, what heats our houses. Methane is natural gas. The industry has reduced methane emissions dramatically over the past several years, yet they're deciding to regulate it. It seems pretty politically symbolic, so I don't want to speculate.
When you mentioned it a little while ago, 3 hotels in a small Pennsylvania town, what happens when all the wells are built out? And that points to a bigger question. You're talking about the billions of dollars required for export terminals. The production so far follows the curve of a rush. How confident are we that future production will sustain the numbers necessary to keep these export terminals in production for long enough to pay for themselves?
Yeah, I'm very confident, and one of the reasons is because when we estimate how much oil and gas we have, we're always on a low end. We always come back, and you saw that. The government has about 2,000 TCF, ICF has 3,500, and ICF's probably low. And what we're seeing is the Department of Energy is projecting that our gas production and our oil production to remain high for decades. And it's really because we have tremendous amounts of these shale and tight deposits. If you look at what's happening in the Permian, they're discovering layer after layer. It's like a birthday cake. So you go down 5,000 feet, you go down 7,000 feet, you go down 10, 12,000 feet. So they're finding more and more of it, and you can go back and hit the seams you haven't hit. So the experts believe it's going to be sustained for a long time. Now on the gas production side, we've essentially hit a ceiling. We're only able to provide to the U.S. market, and that's it. So that's production. We're done. But if we had the ability to export LNG to Europe or wherever else, we could add to that. And we're going to have additional gas going to electricity generation because that's just the way it's heading and it's cheap. But essentially the U.S. market is the market. But we're not talking about dramatic quantities going out LNG. We're talking 10, maybe 10 BCF, maybe 10%. Sir?
These government regulators usually look to be best and brightest in their industry, and yet at the same time, nobody I'm aware of predicted a 50% reduction in the price of oil a year ago. Why?
I don't think anybody believed that this energy renaissance was going to be as powerful as it is. I don't think anybody expected this to happen the way it's happened.
I mean, I'm just like, none of the experts predicted.
No, nobody did.
Are they really, that doesn't give you much confidence.
Well, I think the oil and gas industry is routinely underestimated in what it can do. Like I said, we have some of the best engineers, best geologists in the world, and they find ways to get the oil and gas out of the rock. And there was, I guess, a fair lack of confidence that would be able to find more in this country. And I think U.S. ingenuity was put to the test, and they exceeded expectations. And those in the government are sitting in their offices. They're not out in the field understanding what's really happening, and a lot of it's probably related to that more than anything, that it's the private enterprise out in the field doing the work that is happening while the rest of us are kind of sleeping. It's a good question. Yes, sir?
You mentioned that the states regulate well enough when it comes to environmental concerns. There have been, as we mentioned, earthquakes, carcinogens in the groundwater and the air around fracking sites. Do you think that would, make the case for more effective state regulations? Or
Yes, it would. It would. It would. No cases have been linked to hydraulic fracturing when it comes to groundwater contamination. There have been over 1 million wells and no cases because of what I've demonstrated. You got the case. What's happened, though, is that you could get sloppy at the surface, and that has happened. And that's why you need enforcement, inspection, and those types of things in place. But that's how the regulators have responded. If you look in places like Pennsylvania and Colorado, they've revised their casing and cementing standards. They've changed the depths that you have to run extra layers. They've put in additional requirements for tanks rather than having open pits. So they do make adjustments based upon what they are seeing and learning in the field, and they're much better and much more adept at doing that than the federal government. That's been clear. So I think when you have an incident, that demonstrates a need for the states and not the federal government to step in. But let's not forget that the states are managing oil and gas drilling operations, but the federal government is applying environmental laws. Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Air Act, that all applies. Now the states take on the burden of implementing those. So you do have environmental laws and OSHA laws apply to these operations. So there's a lot. We're talking about the drilling operations. States are regulating that. A lot of the other stuff is under federal regulation, and that's what we're trying to avoid additional overreach on the regulatory side by the CPA. Take one more, sir.
What's the average lifespan of a well?
We don't know yet because we're so early on this. The wells that have been developed over the past 6-7 years are still flowing. There's some who believe that these wells will flow for 25, 30, 35 years. No, there's a decline. I mean, the pressure subsides, and over time they're producing less, but they can continue to produce for a few decades. So that's the belief, but a lot of this we won't know until 10, 15, 20 years from now. But then, as I've said, they're looking at other technologies, such as just going back and refracturing and getting in there and breaking it open again to release more from the rocks because it's so tightly trapped in there. There's a sense that you could find ways to get more out of the rock. And there's things like Keragen out in the Rockies, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming. It's not the oil you get from this shale. It's called oil shale, not shale oil. But it's almost like what you get in the oil sands. And they believe there's hundreds of billions of barrels of that out west. It's almost like what you're developing in Alberta. And then talk about methane hydrates. There's a sense that over time you find technologies to get these sources that nobody thought we could get oil and gas from. So the opportunities will continue to be there. Yes, ma'am?
Could you barrels in 2009. And now it's
9. We're averaging 9 million barrels a day of production. And of course, imports have gone down. So we were importing 10, 11, and we're down to probably 8 or 7. And what's interesting is that we don't have, the president wants to double exports. We don't have export restrictions on what our refineries put out. Our refineries are exporting 9 million barrels of refined product a day. So our trade deficit has gone down dramatically because of petroleum exports and the fact that we're importing less on the oil side. So it's been an amazing story. And our refineries, we haven't built a new refinery in, 30 years, 40 years? They're expanding their capacity within their own fence line and refining more and more. And it's all, feeding our U.S. market. So that's a tremendous story as well. It's a great energy story we have. We just got to keep the momentum going. It's just regulations. It's too hard to do. It costs too much money. It's much easier to just think of Keystone XL pipeline. It's much easier to just expand your own facility than to try to build one from scratch. So it's essentially a regulatory nightmare to try to do that. You think of offshore. You've got 27 statutes, 30 or so approvals, 88 regulatory parts that apply to offshore development. It's crazy. And you try to get 27 different permits. It's a lot of people being employed trying to get permits. So, well, thank you all. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.